Today is April 30th, 2012. We're at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Joe Bruckner. I'm a volunteer with the Atlanta History Center. And with me today is Tony Hilliard, who's also a volunteer at the Atlanta History Center. We're very honored today to have with us Steve Martin. Steve is an Army veteran and served time in the Vietnam War. And we're honored to have Steve with us to tell us his story. This is part of the Veterans History Project that's sponsored by the Library of Congress. And Mr. Martin, we really appreciate you coming in to talk to us about your experiences both in the military and in life.
It's my pleasure.
Could you give us your full name and current address?
It's Stephen, S-T-E-V-E-N-J, James Martin.
And what is your current address?
Smyrna, Georgia, 30082.
And where and when were you born?
1941, September the 17th, in Toccoa, Georgia.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing.
Well, to give you some background, my father's father died in a tractor accident as a tenant farmer, and my dad was 5 years old. And so he and some others got sent out to an orphanage and ultimately into some family homes. But the long story short, as he got older, the older brother took those kids and brought them up to Greenville, and my dad started working at a plant there. And my oldest brother, Daryl Martin, who was in the Air Force for a period, was in Greenville. And then we moved to Toccoa, Georgia, and he worked at La Turnover, and that was in 1941. And he volunteered after working at this big steel factory, I think. He started driving the bus for the Currahee Mountain, the Band of Brothers, World War II, and he would go over to Currahee Mountain and bring them back to the railroad station. And my dad never said anything about this, but my uncle said that somebody came up and said, Alvin, you're really a good bus driver. Why don't you put in an application for Greyhound? And that's what he did. And then that's when we moved to Atlanta in like 1943. And my younger sister and brother were born in Atlanta, and I grew up in Atlanta and my older brother. Mm-hmm. But my dad was in the Marine Corps in 43, and I've got a picture here of his company. Mm-hmm. With these pith helmets, and he's essentially in the middle, and the company commander standing on the steps that's with his back to you was Tyrone Power, who was a movie star. And and here's a separate picture of Tyrone Power.
Okay.
And so we lived in Atlanta, grew up in Atlanta at Fowler Street and 14th Street, when there was no expressway, and had another younger brother and then a younger sister. I went to Spring Street Grammar School, which is now the Atlanta Puppetry Arts Center. It's still there. And I went to O'Keefe High School, and that's part of Georgia Tech. They bought that. That's right there at 10th Street in 85. And then I went to University of Georgia and worked my way through there. And I worked at points at Bernstein's Funeral Home for about 2 and 3 years, where we did the emergency ambulance service. And I got involved at ROTC in Georgia, and it was mandatory back then as a land-grant college. And so in my junior year, they asked me if I wanted to go to advance. And I said, well, sure. And so I stayed in the ROTC program, and in '63, we went to Fort Benning and stayed at Harmony Church, which are some old buildings that are now, there's a few been removed to the museum in Columbus. And one kind of a funny story, and I think it really helped my career, I guess, that's the only thing I can do, is that we were in the 4th platoon and we could never get the buffer to clean the floor. And so the first Saturday, me and a buddy went into town and we got in my car and we went and rented a buffer, brought it back in, put it in the sergeant's private room, and he comes in and says, what in the, you know what, is doing in my bedroom? And I told him the story that we couldn't get it, and I said, it's my buffer, and I became known as the buffer. And we got our floors cleaned, and I'm convinced that Sergeant Polly and the colonel says, this guy's got some initiative, you know.
Yeah.
And so, and we had a lot of good friends, and we stayed in touch with that. So, and then I went to, I found out that I took flight training of 50 hours because the Army would pay for 50 hours. They didn't care whether you got a ticket or anything, just to see if you had the capability of flying. And that is, you may know this, that in the military, if a person flunks out of flight school, that's not a bad thing. Some people just cannot fly, and they can be the most, greatest officer in the world. So this was kind of a system to, if you qualified, they were willing to spend the money, and then they push you through, and that's what happened to me. So in '64, I graduated, and with honors and with a distinguished military, and I gave up my. I took it was a reserve unit, because I wanted to go to flight school first. Otherwise, you'd have to go 2 years active duty, then go to flight school. So I went to infantry basic at Fort Benning in August through the fall, and I got my orders to go to flight school, and I was doing some cadre stuff down there. And I thought I had signed up for parachute jump school, but somehow it didn't get to me. But I found out later while I was down there that the orders were there, and they said, you're supposed to be in jump school. And I said, I never got them. So who knows what might have twisted that. Yeah. So in January of '64 or '65, I went into Fort Walters, Texas, and we were class 6510, and these are all of our classmates. And some washed out, but the majority of them stayed. So we did the 3 months program there, and there were a couple of times I walked home from the flight line saying, do you really want to be a pilot? And sure enough, I hung in there, and I wound up being top of the class in that phase. And then we went to Fort Rucker, and we transitioned into an old H-23 for 2 or 3 months, and then we started flying the Hueys. And that's a jet engine, and that was the hottest thing going. So I got my commercial pilot's license, I got my instrument rating, and again, the Army didn't require that, but I just wanted it. And I think, looking back, that some of the things I got to do in Vietnam is because I had all of these ratings and certifications. Yeah. So in September of '65, I got my orders, and I went to San Francisco by myself. Had no clue. They just gave me some orders and said report to, and then the next thing, I stayed a couple of days there, and then I flew into Vietnam.
Okay, before we go to the next step, I want to ask you something about what you were able to learn before you went to Vietnam. This was relatively early in the conflict. Had you had an opportunity to talk to other pilots who had been in Vietnam and had served and share their experiences?
So, yes, some of them were instructors. When we went to summer camp in '63, most of the cadre down there had been advisors in Vietnam, and they gave us a lot of input. We had courses at night hiking and through the Army, and then in '64 at Fort Benning, we did an awful lot, and every one of the cadre at Fort Benning were pretty much had at least one tour, maybe more, in Vietnam.
Okay, good.
And there was pretty much advisors then, and then
Right.
I don't know the exact date.
What month did you just say this was when you headed to Vietnam?
In the end of October, 1st September.
Of 65.
I mean, 1st of November.
65.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, please continue. You were leaving.
Yeah.
You left San Francisco.
So we
and headed
got
Vietnam.
into Saigon, and they, we weren't assigned to a unit or anything, so they went over to quote Camp Alpha, and it was a big tent and a platform, and we said, this is not looking good. And we would walk down the street. This was kind of, I've always kept this in my mind. We stayed there 2 nights in these cots, and it was hot and no air conditioning. But during the day, we walked down and we see the Air Force, and they've got this beautiful brick building and air conditioning and a bar, and I'm going, aren't we from the same country? So, and then again, there were 2 other guys that came in, and they came in one day and says, we got your assignments. So we get on the helicopter, and the first guy stops in the 173rd, and he's a pilot, and we looked over, and they had tents, platforms, and I went, And so then the next guy we took out to, I think the big red one, I couldn't remember, and he was in tents. And then they took me up to Benoit and put me on a deuce and a half, and I'm riding through town, and I go outside of town, and I go down, they turn and go down, and I'm just looking around, looking at people, and we pull up to this building, this pretty nice looking villa, and that was our quarters. And I said, well, maybe I'm doing okay. We had facilities, and this was the Rattlers emblem, or this is a booklet on it. It's the Rattlers and the Firebirds, and the Rattlers were all of the company, and the Firebirds were the gunships.
Okay.
And back then, they used an old Huey B model, as in boy.
You want to hold that?
Yeah, and let me put this emblem up here if I can. This is our, can you get that emblem? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So when I got there, we had separate rooms, individual rooms, or not individual, 2 per room. And it had a bar, and it had a mess hall, it had hooch maids that would iron your stuff, clean it, wash it. We had jeeps to go out to a helipad, and so I got signed in. And as it turned out, a good friend of mine, Tom Griffith, was in my class, and he was a West Pointer, and he was about a week or 2 ahead of me. So he was the guy that really helped me, because he being from West Point and being over there just a month, he knew everything. He knew everything.
Yeah.
So Tom is just an incredible, and there's a little story about that for him, is that when he went to helicopter school, his branch kind of said, Tom, you're going to ruin your career being a helicopter pilot. I mean, you're an armor man, or, you know. And he says, I'm going to fly. And so he did. And he did his term, and then he decided he wanted to fly jets. And he asked his branch to kind of help him because he was an early captain in the Army versus what the Air Force. So they got that straightened out. And they said, you're going to ruin your career. And he retired as a 3-star general. So, you know, that's just, you never know.
You never do. What unit were you in at the time?
The Rattlers, 501st.
501st, okay.
Yeah. And let me backtrack a little bit. We were the first brigade as a helicopter company. I think it was the 120th was there when they had the old H-21 Bananas.
Mm-hmm.
And they were over there in the early 60s. And so we had our unit in Benoit, and our sister company, the 118th Cowboys, were down the street from us. And then we had 2 companies in Saigon, and that constituted the 4 units in which we were assigned to first the Vietnamese people, and then any requests from the Special Forces, the Rangers, or the Vietnamese, or a unit like the 173rd or 25th Infantry Division. They were just getting in and getting, you know, building up. So we had the experience. I mean, we had pilots that had been over there for a year. And experience over there is, to me, was everything. And we were allowed to fly in I-Corps. I went up to Da Nang one time, and we decided we wanted to see if we could get up to 10,000 feet, and it took us about 3 hours. Because it was like, you know, just like pulling a rope, because that air gets so thin and those blades just don't get the lift. And then we, north of that, we mostly operated in the 3 Corps, which was Benoit, Saigon, and then we'd go down into the Delta and assist troops, or we would get assigned either to a unit, or we'd get assigned to a ranger or a Vietnamese cadre group to go out and look at the ranger outposts, and or go around and look at different things and training. So that was another plus for me, that we had warrant officers and officers that had been over there 6 and 8 and 9 months. And they really, and then once you got there with enough hours and enough ability, you could be an aircraft commander. And I think after 2 months, I got my aircraft commander seat, Rattler 19. And that means experienced people fly as the captain of the helicopter, and then you'd have the younger ones. Or sometimes we had more people, you know. If you had 2 aircraft commanders, you just worked it out. But it was really a neat group of guys, and they were really savvy. And I marvel now that the Army made an incredible thing to let these young guys, privates or whatever, go through flight school, and if they can fly, they get a warrant officer. Because those warrant officers, 19-year-old guys, could fly those choppers just like a motorcycle or whatever. And that they needed pilots like that. And that's another thing you may not know, that most services, if you wash out a flight school, that does not go against your record, because some people just cannot fly. I mean, they could be the best general in the world, but so that never was a bad mark. But if you flunked out of some other school, different question. So the first 2 months, I flew every day, and actually had more hours than were allowed. And so I'd usually have 3, 4, 5 days at the end of the month. I could just go do what I wanted to do. And so I would just help our chef or our, if they needed a lift, I could do stuff like that. And there's a few stories on that. But our villa, it had a nice...
Could you tell some of the stories?
Yeah, one was a chef, I guess. It wouldn't call a chef, but the head guy. He'd been over there 2 years before, and he says, "Lieutenant, can you fly me down to Saigon? I need to get some special stuff for our major." And so I said, "Sure." And I took him down there, and he knew, having been 3 tours over there, he took me to a restaurant that I would never walk into, but it was one of the finest meals I ever had. Really? But he was in their getting supplies, getting some steak, and he was looking at some wine, and he said, this Vietnamese guy said, it's too high. And I happened to be looking over there, and I saw this French Chateau Lafite Rothschild, and I said, "Sarge, see if he'll sell these bottles right here for the same price." And they said, "Yeah." And so the next day, what happened was he went back, he fixed our commander a great dinner. He had some kind of special deal, had the wine. And he came in and he said, "Lieutenant, the major loved that wine." And he said, "You're on my list. Anything you need, not a problem." And again, that was just kind of helping your brother and doing things for others rather than, just trying to. And he used to keep in touch with me, but I've lost track of him. I can't find him anymore. And just some general stuff. Bob Hope was over there, and we were supposed to pick him up after the show, and we were lined up, and Bob Hope jumped in the plane in front of us, and he was supposed to be in our craft. But then we moved up, and we got Eddie Fisher, and so we got to fly some people, and they were awfully nice and awfully helpful. And then my first encounter with a Viet Cong was a 13-year-old boy, and he had been being interrogated, and he came out, and they said, "Lieutenant, I need you to take this young man down to another area for another interrogation." I said, and he had a kind of a black eye or a bruise, and I said, What's going on here? And he said, "How old is this kid?" He said, 13 years old. And I said, why is he in this state? He said, "Well, he was sitting up in a tree shooting people, killing people." And I said, we'll fix him. So we put him in the aircraft, and I told the crew chief, I said, "Don't buckle him in, keep the doors open." And I didn't. I assumed this kid had never been into an aircraft. And so we took off, and we started doing big sideways deals, and you're looking down, and this guy is shaking, and he was trying to hold on, and I told the crew chief to say, "Don't let him tie down anything." So then we landed, and we pushed him to another, and about an hour later, this guy came up, and he says, who's flying this aircraft? And I said, "I am." He said, "Lieutenant, I don't know what you did, but this guy told us all we needed." And said he was where his buddies were and what he had to do. And I said, "Well, we threatened to throw him out, but we scared him to death. We came close to that." So that was a fun experience.
Would you get your missions each morning?
Correct.
Okay.
And you pretty much at night knew you were going to fly. You didn't know what.
Okay.
And because we didn't work as much as you. Maybe 2 ships was the most we'd get together. You were either single ship or 2 ships. And if there were 2 ships, we'd usually go out to these rangers, outposts, and stuff like that, so that we can get their cadre of ARVNs and let them learn how to do things. Or that, and this was another thing, the rangers out there would get us to go look at places. And we said, ask this guy, we'll do anything you want to do. So we got to see and land and look for and get a lot of intelligence.
Okay.
And I've always been impressed with the helicopters. They can go anywhere.
Yeah. Was your typical mission recon or armed support for a infantry unit?
Predominantly, it was only in the first 2 months was they were all trying to, like I said, the 173rd Airborne and in the Hawaiian 25th Infantry Division. They were just getting set up.
Okay.
So we were out there just looking and mostly taking care of Vietnamese officers.
Okay.
And going out in the woods. And it's interesting, in Benoit, it's pretty flat in that area, but there's this Tainan Mountain out west towards Cambodia, and that was a physical thing you could see, and that was kind of a point of reference as to where you're flying, because it all just, it's pretty flat. Or you try to, we had maps and we had or charts, and we had pretty good instructions on what to do. The first person I shot at was a woman. And fortunately I didn't meet her, I hit her, but we were flying in a Coochie and all of a sudden we started taking fire. And so when we landed in this Tom Griffith, the West Pointer, we let our cartridges go off and whatever they were doing. We were standing there and all of a sudden he turns around and starts firing at this woman running. I mean, it was, 100 yards or more. And I said, Tom, that's a woman. He said, you're right. And she was shooting at us. I said, oh my God. So I don't know if we ever hit her or not, but we fired at her.
Good.
Another thing that this friend of mine, Tom Griffith, got me into teaching English. And I said, why are you doing this? And he said, well, we're volunteers. We need to learn them to teach. And he said, you're a single guy, and there are a lot of women in there. And I said, say no more. So I would go and teach, and they were very helpful. But it made me realize how difficult the English language is to a foreign person. That when you say, like the word there, T-H-E-R-E or T-H-E-I-R, and they'd look at you and go, what? Yeah. But they were interested. They wanted to learn, and I saw in that short period of 4 months that they grew and learned more about Americans, and they had some good business skills or good work skills, and they were very, very hopeful. And I was impressed with them. They weren't a bunch of, they worked.
Yeah. Well, one thing I always like to ask is whether you had dealings with the civilians, and you obviously did have quite a few dealings with the civilians.
Right, and they were interesting. They were. I was more concerned getting to the school and back than once I got in the school. I was okay. Yeah. You just never know. I mean, we weren't. Benoit was a pretty big, fairly big town. Not anything big as Saigon, but it had a big Air Force base, and our helipad was right next to the Air Force Base. And that's another thing that we used to see every once in a while. The big, what was it, the U-2 pilot? That plane takes off. It's a Jeep runs at the end of the wing and holds this thing up so that it won't, because it only has two wheels.
Yeah.
And those things come running down, and then you see them take off, and it's just straight up.
Huh.
You know, they're up at 50,000 feet
Gee.
in no time. And landing, same thing. They put a Jeep at the one end, and when he lands, that Jeep runs in there and grabs this pole to stabilize the from flopping over.
Yeah.
So that was a big Air Force base, and Benoit was a fairly good-sized town, but
Yeah.
Saigon was
Right.
the place. A couple of times we did fly into Laos and Cambodia, even though Johnson said we weren't over there.
Talk about that, what you did, what your mission was, and what you saw.
It was search and either search and find or search and destroy. And usually it's search and find to see what's out there, and that was plausible. To search and kill, you had to have an order on that. And so it was, but when they start firing at you, that allows you to, defend yourself.
Yeah.
And so, again, that was close to Tainan Mountain. And so that was a point that we knew we were in Cambodia or Laos or wherever, as a point of reference.
Did you see a lot of activity when you would fly into Cambodia and Laos?
Yes, I was amazed. And further north, which I didn't go that often, was the bigger trail and the bigger pieces. And another thing is that I saw quite a few Agent Orange defoliation, and never thought anything about it.
Yeah.
But I wound up with hairy cell leukemia.
Oh, you did?
And they attribute that to Agent Orange.
Yeah.
Or it's one of the
Right.
one of the lists to it.
Are you still affected by that today?
Yeah, I kept getting partial remissions. And so I did it the first time, and it lasted 4 years, and then I did it again, and it lasted 4 years. And we found through the American Cancer Institute in Washington, had a new experimental drug, and so we started giving my blood and putting in FedEx and going back and forth, and through this process of going back and forth and see if I qualify, the white cells went back up. And I had started charting these things on a chart, and every 4 years it would go below the criteria. And I showed this to my doctor, my dermatologist, not dermatologist, but
Neurologist.
Perry Ballard, is
Well,
blood with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so hematologist. Good job. So I said, Perry, it went back up. And I showed him these charts, and he looked at it and he said, that's a good picture. And so we did it another 4 years, and it went down again. And but it went back up without treatment. And this past April, it came down again, and he says, have you got any trips going? I said, yeah, we're going to Costa Rica. He says, go, and let's just see what happens. And sure enough, I came back, and it went back up.
Huh.
So, I say that because if you're a patient, you shouldn't be a patient, you should be an advocate, or you need to do research, or you need to, because
Yeah.
everybody's trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, what was the condition again?
It's a hairy cell leukemia. And it had Scripps invented a drug out in California, 2-CDE, and that was the only thing going. Before that, all the articles were that they would just try to do something, and at some point, you just have your spleen would, build up, and then you'd die of pneumonia or some other disease. There was really no, but Scripps, I used that,
Yeah.
2-CDA. So, get to the day of the incident. We were not scheduled to fly. This was February the 22nd, 1966. And we had a memorial service for our brigade commander, Lieutenant Colonel Honor, and Captain Smith, who was his pilot. Captain Smith's father was Howard K. Smith, the journalist. And Colonel Honor said no low-level flying between Saigon and Benoit because of these high-tension power lines. And I assumed that the colonel was flying because he was hot-dogging it low level and caught those wires, killed everybody.
Gee.
I think I heard, I don't know if it's true, that Captain Smith, was not, implicated in any matter. And they did have a couple of nurses on board going up to the lot or something.
Yeah.
So we had just finished this memorial service. And so I just wandered into town because I wasn't flying, and there were just a handful of people to stand by. And there was an emergency airlift. And the siren went off. And I said, I've always known, don't ever volunteer to do anything in the military. But I said, I'll go over there and just help them and see if I can help them. So when I got over there, all of a sudden there was a shortage of pilots. So I jumped in the right seat, and we were in two sections. There were 6 planes and 6 planes, 12 planes. And we were the last unit to go it was an emergency airlift to lift some troops out of an area into a hot area. So we all took off, but before that, the pilot next to me, Bob Browning, came in and got in, and then this Lefty Frizzell, they called him Lefty Frizzell, he was a country singer. He came in and says, I want to fly with Steve, get out. And he got in, and so I was flying. And this will flip back to kind of an interesting thing. So we took off, and we flew, and they were lifting all these troops out, and the section in front of us went in and said, that's all we got to move. And so our section, there was one plane ahead of me and 5 behind. And so we turned around and came back to the snake pit, and we were shutting down, and the plane in front of us was still powered up. And I said, what's going on? He said, they need us back. So we went back to this location to pick up the rest of the troops. Some of them must have gotten there somehow. And Lefty was flying, and we landed, and it was a big dust bowl. And so the plane in front of us, when he lifted, it was just a pure, you couldn't see. So our normal routine for that was the lead ship, and he wasn't normally a lead ship, he was the second section. Just, you move down the road, and then the 2 planes split out to the side. And looking back, at the time, it was such a, it was such an difficult loss. I found out, or by looking at the support, they put 7 American troops on our ship, plus our 4 crew. And the rule of thumb over there was that if it's 5 Americans and your crew of 4, that's it. If it's ARVNs, it can be 7, because they're smaller, less weight. So for whatever reason, our crew chief or whomever the LZ guy was trying to put, I guess, as much as he could. So we had 7 people, all of us did. And so when that first plane picks up, we can't see him. So Lefty just takes the stick and just moves out to the right and heads down the runway. Well, unbeknownst to us, because he says, we radioed and nobody in all of our planes heard anything from that first ship. And the first ship couldn't get off, or he couldn't get enough RPM. And this particular pilot, again, later I found out that that was the weakest ship and it should have been in the back of the bus. But it's just pragmatic.
Yeah.
And so for some reason, they moved to the right, and we had lifted off and we were just running, and all of a sudden we caught all of that rotor, and it killed the our not the gunner but the crew chief, and 1 American sitting on the end, and Lefty. And when we saw it for a split second, that propeller hit with the nose down, hit the bottom, and of course the fuel tanks are on the bottom. And I felt it going upside down. And I thought, this is where it gets hazy. At first I thought, I grabbed the stick to stabilize it. I'm not sure that maybe somebody else grabbed the stick, like the good guy upstairs. And we just pancaked it in there. And I didn't even look at Lefty for whatever reason, because my instinct was get out of the aircraft, because if it's that magnesium will just go up like fire. And I couldn't get out the door because we just crashed it. I can't find that picture, but what's left of that aircraft was just the studs and the jet deal. So I stood up, and that's when I realized my leg was broken. So I had to climb over the instrument panel and slide down the front of that plane. And I've told this story because it truly was. I said, John Wayne would be proud of me, And so I got on the ground and I started crawling, and I thought I had just these 3 fingers missing, but this thumb and the little finger was smashed. Ultimately, they had to remove it. So I'm digging in the ground, crawling. I took my medical pack out and stuck some morphine in this leg, and that's the only one I had. And a young guy came up to me and he said, can I help you? And I said, give me a shot in this arm. And I kept crawling, and all of a sudden, all the ammo's going off from the fire, and it's got tracers, and I'm saying, oh my goodness, I'm going to get shot by my own my own bullets. But it didn't have any rifling.
Yeah.
And it was just whizzing over, and I'm climbing, and that's the reason that we had to dig deep here, because I was crawling so much. Finally got away from it, and we got someone to come over and put me on a stretcher and got me to a chopper, and I was in a field hospital within 20 minutes.
Wow.
And I look back at World War II. If you read the books and the studies, 1, they couldn't get to the area sometimes. 2, they couldn't find the area. 3, they didn't know how to get out of the area. And I'm convinced that if we didn't have choppers in Vietnam, we would have 300,000 or 400,000 dead people. Because even though we weren't medevac, any chopper pilot, if he gets a call, he'll go down there and get it. And so that's what I'm amazed about, that
Yeah.
only having the 58 something
Yeah.
troops. So I got to the hospital, and I didn't know who this guy was. He was a doctor, obviously, and he was rushing around looking at my hand and looking. My foot was turned 180 degrees, and he pulled on the boot and turned the foot upright. And he said, "Wiggle your toes." And I wiggled them. He said, "We got a chance." And I said, "Do me one favor." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Don't call my parents." And he said, "Okay." I said, "No, promise." He said, "Okay." So at that time, I did not know who this guy was other than the field hospital doctor. As it turned out, his name is James Marvel, and he was a captain, Captain Marvel.
Oh,
And this was in '66, and in '68, when MASH came out as a movie, he was Hawkeye.
really?
He was
Good.
non-military,
Gosh.
but an incredible surgeon. Because when I got to Walter Reed, they said, "This is a way to put a leg back together." And I found out this was a field hospital. If they couldn't fix you up in 5 to 7 days, you're out of here. I mean, you're going either back to the troops or going to the States. Well, he wanted to do these, all of these grafts on my leg and closing it and get closure. Because our medical doctor came in. He said, "What are you doing with that cast on your leg?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I got a call saying we want to amputate this leg." I said, "I hope you didn't let him do it." He said, "No, this guy just, wanted to be prepared." And so it's a remarkable, 2 years before that, this was MASH. Because they did this pedicle graft. What they did is they cut it across here, put the hand here, and tied it in here. And it's such a thick deal. This is all from my chest,
Really?
right here.
Yeah.
If you, it's attached here, so the blood is running this way. And then once the blood starts running this way, after about a week or 2 weeks, I can't remember, then they would cut it loose and tack it down because it had circulation, which is really cool to get that kind of.
Yes.
And the same way with the leg, they would they kept it in a cast, or they'd take the cast off, and they did some skin grafts and transfers and closed that up really good. He was remarkable, and but he came in one day and he said, when I said, "Promise, don't tell my parents,"
Yeah.
well, my mother called Washington, and he said, "Well, I just got my fanny chewed out." And I said, "What for?" And he told a story about that. And I said, "What can I do?" He said, Don't worry." And he used some unlettered,
Yeah.
4-letter words. I don't care. And what are they going to do? Throw me out? And so and to show again, I think these are great stories. Everybody kept coming around touching this flap here, and I said, "Jim, what, Captain Marvel?" I said, what? He said, "Well, we've tried 3 of these and they didn't work." And I said, "Oh, that's good." And I said, "What do you think the deal is?" And he said, "I think it's air conditioning.
Oh.
It stabilizes your body, and you're not sweating, and you're not, And so everybody was touching it, and they were very anxious for this, and it did happen.
Yeah.
And so they finally cut it loose and tacked it down. And so then he comes in there one day and says, "Steve, this is inspection day, so don't bleed on these sheets here, but I want to look at this thing." And he said, "So be careful." And so he cut this off and took the bandage off, and it was just kind of like it didn't have this, it was just one big piece.
Yeah.
And he says, "What do you think? Isn't that good?" And I said, "It looks like a dead chicken or something." And he says, "Don't get smart with me." He said, "I came close to putting your nipple, which is right underneath this button, right here." And you know, he would have done it. Because the cut underneath that I want to show you is right under your nipple. So I lost track of him, you know, and I finally got Mary Lou Keener. She helped me. I don't know if y'all, she used to be here in Atlanta and what have you, but she found two doctors, Jim Marvel. And incidentally, there was a major in that field hospital, just like in MASH. You know,
Really?
a dirt guy, or whatever you want to call him. I'm not slandering anybody.
No, not at all.
And so I called up in Rhode Island, and I said, I'm a patient of Dr. Marvel. Is he in? And she says, what's your name? And I gave her their name. She said, I don't have a patient. I said, no, this was a patient back in 1966 in Vietnam. And there was this dead silence from this little girl. She's thinking, oh, there's some wacko on the other end of the line. So finally, Jim called. And I talked to him, finally ran him down after about 30-something years.
Gosh.
He came to Atlanta. We had dinner with him. And I wrote him a long letter, and I still keep in touch with him. His son works for Coca-Cola, and I called him one day and I said, Jim, I said, I didn't know he had a son there. I said, when are you going to come to Atlanta? He said, well, as a matter of fact, my son is in Atlanta for Coca-Cola. And I said, give me his number. And he said, what for? And I said, I want to tell him what a great dad he is. So that was a great story.
That had to be pretty emotional when you saw him
Yeah.
again after 30 years.
Yeah. And he's, and like I said, I think earlier, that Walter Reed, everything done was done by not just one doctor. They'd have a body of people, and every one of them said, this is a way to piece a leg together. This is a way to, and they started doing bone grafts from here to here. See, I only had to here.
Okay.
So they put this bone graft up here, and then they cut it here, and then they cut it another time, and they cut it another time. And so it functions.
That's amazing.
I know it was all.
That's probably about as good a medical care as you could have gotten anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. They did. And it, let me see if we found Marvel, Walter Reed. I guess going back to Walter Reed, I took it upon myself to help some of the other soldiers, or help the enlisted people. And so by doing that, I got some good freebies. I got to go to the what is it, Pimlico, the second chain in the
Preakness?
Preakness. Took some enlisted people out there, and so the gal who worked the activities, would get me things to do. And getting back to, we would go out and meet people in civilians in the public, and they were very grateful and
Good.
gracious, and this was like in 66 and 7, and it wasn't until the late 60s that you got all this.
So you didn't have any negative incidents of people mistreating you when you came
No,
back?
because I went to law school and I had to bury my head to survive in the books and finish the. And I don't know what I would have done if someone had come up and said something like that. I really don't. I've thought of that, and it just didn't make any sense.
Now, you met somebody pretty special while you were
Oh, yes.
in the hospital, didn't you?
At Walter Reed. And Judy was, what have I got here? I was at Walter Reed, when I first got there, I was up in the PT room, and of course they all wear the white clothes like nurses and physical therapists. And this this gal that came in here with a green uniform on, and I said, well, that's a pretty sporty little thing. And long story short, I met her, and we went up to have drinks at the officers club, and that was the first time I met her. And long story short, we started dating and got married, and she got out of the Army. She went to Syracuse and graduated, and she found out that the Army they had a wonderful program for nurses and physical therapists. And there were some men and women at Walter Reed that were on this program, that they would pay all of their college tuition for you. They would enlist them as a private, and if you stayed in the program, you'd get all your books and tuition, and you'd get some kind of pay as a private or whatever. And then, so once you finished, you got your bars. You had 5 years of seniority, so you get it much bigger, and you only had to pay back 3.
Wow.
And Judy only had to pay back 2 because she was a college graduate, and so she did that. Got out and went to Philadelphia and decided that the Army was a much better, more energy efficient and helpful, and that's how I met her.
Okay. And how long have you been married?
67, 30, 40, 42, whatever.
For a bunch of years.
Bunch of years.
Congratulations, man.
Yeah, and I can't remember if she met Don Plunkett at Fort Belvoir. I think, did I?
No.
You haven't mentioned that on the tape.
Oh, yeah, when we finally moved to Atlanta, fortuitously a book or something fell open, there were some pictures, and I looked down and I see Don Plunkett, a dear friend of mine. And I said, how do you know this guy? Oh, well, we were up here at Fort Belvoir and one Christmas, and none of us went home, and so we all just, and that's where I met him. He cut down a tree with a D-shovel, and so I called Don and said, Don, I got some woman here that knows you. He said, what? But, yeah, and Judy, we did a lot of boating throughout the rivers. We've done bicycling throughout Europe, and carry-on gear and travel. It's a neat way to travel. She's very engaged. She doesn't do physical therapy anymore, but
You shared a lot of adventures.
yeah.
Now, you met somebody else pretty special, not as special as Judy, but you met somebody else that we probably know about that you told us
Yeah.
before we started.
This was a story back when I was at the field hospital. Ann Margaret came in and came over and asked me my name and where I was from, and she says, I've never been to Atlanta. And I said, well, if you ever get to Atlanta, call me, And I grew up there. So I was in law school 3 or 4 years later, and she came into Atlanta, and there was and did a show and left. But there was an article in the paper the next day about Ann Margaret. Said this is the first time she'd ever been to Atlanta, and that she remembers a helicopter pilot in Benoit back in 1966.
Gee.
And I said, oh my goodness, I wish I would have known that. And I happened to tell that to a friend of mine. Kirk Wembley was my insurance guy. I knew him from Georgia. And Kirk, being an insurance guy, he decided, for whatever reason, he found out that would be a great connection if she could ever come to Atlanta. So he calls her husband, who was Smith. He used to be on Cookie, something like that.
Yeah.
and he's
Sunset
married
Strip.
to her, yes,
Yeah.
and he is her manager. Well, he didn't tell me anything like this, so 6 months later, she comes back to Atlanta, and he just said, I got some tickets to Ann Margaret. And I said, God, that's great. And so, but I didn't know that he had talked to Smith and told that story, and she said, well, yeah, we'll do it. And so, after, middle of the show, she said, I've got some favorite people here I want you to recognize. And there happened to be 2 or 3 other people that I guess she knew. And it just kind of floored me. And Kirk even asked Smith could he come up afterwards. And sure enough, we went up after stage, and this is the program. You got it. Which was, again, a neat little story.
That's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
When you left Walter Reed, were you discharged from the Army at that point?
Yes, I retired as a
when was that?
captain in August. In fact, they were trying to push me out the door in June, and I said, I really want to wait to do some things. And this colonel, who was a patient, and I was used to help him out on certain things, he calls my branch and says, George, so you got Captain Martin down there? Yep. He says, when do you want to get out? I said, August 3rd. He said, pull his record for August the 3rd. And it happened.
What year was that?
August the 3rd, 1967. And there was another story I forgot. When we were going to the Officers Club,
Mm-hmm.
there was a triple amputee, and we just had, this was early on, and I had a full leg cast, and I had this, and he's losing 3 limbs, and I said, I'm going to put you in his chair, and we're going to go up to the Officers Club and have a beer. He said, I'd love to do that. So we go up there, and I push him up there, and we get in there, and we have nickel beer night or something.
Yeah.
Had a bunch of beers, and as we're coming out, he said, Steve, I'm almost feeling like I'm going to make it.
Really?
And so I'm pushing him out, and I stumped my toe and fell down, and I'm going, there's this walkway going downhill, and he's riding down the road, and I'm going, he's going to kill himself, because, he couldn't,
No.
he only had one hand,
Yeah.
and he wasn't going to, he went down the hill, went across the road, hit the other curb, and flipped into the grass. And by the time I got down there, the MPs were down there. So I go up there, and they says, what's going on here? And I said, well, I'm Lieutenant Martin, and this is Lieutenant Johns, and we just had a few beers. We need to get back to Ward 1. And I thought they were going to lock us up. They saw us. We just had robes on.
Oh, yeah.
It was blue raised with a robe. You could go into the officers' club. The next morning, he got up, and I came into him, and I said, how you feel? And he said, that was the most fun I've had in a long time.
Really?
And that's what it was all about.
Yeah.
For all of us that were amateur, another time we used to go out and go sailing in Annapolis. And the first time we went out there, I had this full leg cast. I had another guy had missing cast. And if you could see that as we were walking towards this boat rental, if you could have seen this guy's eyes, he was saying, please don't come over here to get in my boat. Because we said, we'll use George as an anchor because he's got a big this, and then we're hooping it up. And long story short, we got in there, and I took these guys out sailing, and it just gave them life.
Oh, yeah.
And we started doing that, and we even got some of the staff, a couple of doctors,
Really?
come over, because the Chesapeake Bay is just beautiful.
Yeah. Well, that was wonderful of you to do that.
Well, it is. It's helping your brother.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about what you did after you left the military.
Well, I finished law school. Wasn't sure that I was going to be a lawyer, but I got enthusiastic my last year because we almost won the International Moot Court competition down in Texas. And long story short, I interviewed some big firms, and that was too bureaucratic, kind of like the military. So I found a smaller firm, and I practiced 30 years, 35 years active with Grizzard, Jones, Parker, and Simmons, and Martin. Yeah, no, it's Grizzard, Simmons, and Martin. That was the original one, and then it was Grizzard, Simmons, and Martin. And at some point, when I was 60, I asked myself, do you want to be practicing law at 65? And I said, not no, but hell no. And so I still do some estate work for people, but I retired in 2001, and I do a lot of board work with AAA Auto Club and other family businesses, and I've been fortunate and blessed and like it, but the legal business is tough. It's tougher now. And I think, and I guess the other thing that, a couple of things at Walter Reed, we got to go up to the White House when President Johnson was out of town, and his daughter took us up into the family room, and we got to see that, and we got to see concerts and baseball, and things were very, very active, and we all interacted well with them.
Good.
And then in the 80s, we started getting together and formed up the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association. And as a lawyer, I did the articles and did that stuff, but we had some Walter Stroman, Mal Garland, and a bunch of good people that really pulled this thing together, and that has been a good deal.
Have you had reunions with members of your unit from Vietnam?
Yes, had started. There is a general Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association, is all pilots. And I used to go to those some, and they're so big and so many people that our company, the Firebirds, started to doing every other year. And they're in down near Dallas and Texas. And they have two full, I may have mentioned this, or maybe it's not on tape, they've got two D models
It's not on tape.
red trailers, and they've got red pickup trucks, and they've got a red pickup truck with a big red covered thing for all of it, and they take these to every other year to the Union. We went to Colorado, Nashville, and this year we're going to New Orleans. So I'm going to fly down for a couple of days. And
that's great.
Yeah, it's a great group, and they have done a lot of things for Texas A&M and other, giving memorabilia and a whole bunch, because I guess there were a lot of people, I don't know whether it's because that was the original pilot school down there, or just people in Texas in general. And they've got a lot of stuff, and they do a lot of stuff for that area.
Good. Before we conclude, Tony, do you have any questions?
No.
I want to give you a chance, before we end this interview, to just say anything you want to say, either to fill in any blanks you think you might have left, or deliver a message to people who will see this 2 months from now or 10 years from now. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Well, I feel fortunate all the way around, from being, one, alive, and two, getting a law degree through the military and practicing, and then the things we do with the Atlanta Vietnam Veteran Business Association is volunteer work, and it's helpful. We put up, 25 or 26 plaques around, and we're moving into this arena, and we can still move into other arenas being helpful. And I know Max Torrance really heads up a wonderful deal down at USO, And to see our troops down there is heartwarming. They're active, they're ready to go back, male and female. I've never seen people that are so positive. And that makes me feel good. And our country should feel good about that. I couldn't get my two boys to go, and that's okay. I mean, that's a personal choice.
Yeah, it is.
So I've really been blessed that, and to be alive.
Well, the country's been blessed to have somebody like you. I mean, Tony and I are very honored to be able to sit here with you and hear your story. I mean, you're obviously a brave individual, have a lot of courage. I mean, when you got injured, it's because you volunteered to do something. You didn't have to volunteer.
Yeah.
And also just what you did for your fellow patients, taking them to the officers club and taking them sailing. I mean, that shows a big heart also. So you should be very proud of the life you've lived and your military service and what you did in Vietnam. And again, we're proud to know you, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to hear your story.
Thank both of you and your constituents for doing this and putting this together. And this is it needs to be done. I think it's great. It's a good way, and it made me go back and kind of look through and make you. If you can't find something positive, you're in trouble.
Yeah, true.
Because there are a lot of positives for everybody.
That's right. Well, that's a great attitude, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but thank you for your service.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your service.